for 63 days we saw the city in blazes. We knew that we cannot possibly win.
An army of ordinary citizens fighting the Nazis to save their city.
The battle went from street to street, from house to house, day and night.
The Americans and the British left them on their own.
There was a sense of frustration and injustice that was quite strong.
Their loss was catastrophic. But their story was never told.
Somehow, in history books, there's very little of it.
Thousands and thousands of people that died in the name of freedom, in vain.
D-Day, the Normandy invasion, the turning point in World War II. But all the sacrifice and promise of D-Day would only lead to bitter disappointment in one occupied country, in one war-torn city, a city caught between the Nazis and global politics and Allied tension. Welcome again to CNN Presents. I'm Aaron Brown. The 1944 Warsaw Uprising. It was one of the most heroic and tragic battles of the Second World War, and yet it is among the least well-known. In the summer of '44, the people of Warsaw, buoyed by the Allied invasion to the west and the Soviet advances from the east, took up what little arms they had and struck back boldly at the Nazis. The resistance fighters, men, women, even children, were virtually on their own, fighting impossible odds, fighting, dying, and waiting for help that never arrived. Their 63-day struggle, their doomed attempt to liberate Warsaw. That story now from CNN's David Ensor.
It looks today the way it did for centuries. But the old town of Warsaw, capital of Poland, had to be rebuilt, building by building, brick by brick. "60 years ago, it was reduced to a smoking ruin. Its people killed or banished. Its buildings incinerated. In a rage, Hitler had ordered his troops to flatten the city. Over 80% of it was destroyed. Warsaw had dared to rebel against Nazi rule, its citizens fighting the vastly more powerful German army. They were ordinary people, volunteer soldiers, many of them merely teenagers.
I was leader of the youngest groups, under 16. They were used actually for spying. For that, you could obviously go to concentration camp and be shot on the spot.
We were young, we were optimistic. It didn't occur to me ever that I can get killed or... the only thing I was afraid of was being tortured.
They fought against impossible odds, but you couldn't tell them that.
You know, the passion with which we participated in all those things was probably difficult to understand to people who never lost freedom. And we had this terrific faith that we are going to be free.
The German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II.
Poland's ordeal began September 1st, 1939.
Poland and the world learned the meaning of a grim new word, blitzkrieg.
Hitler's forces charged across Poland's borders in the infamous blitzkrieg, and World War II began.
I saw these huge planes, German planes. They were black with these crosses on it. They were flying very, very low, I guess, to escape the anti-aircraft. But the trees just started bending down, and I was terrified.
Julian Kulski was just a boy when he saw German troops enter a town square where there was a synagogue.
And they brought in the orchestra and they started playing German tunes and hoisted the swastika. And then they got the rabbi and tied him up to the synagogue and put the synagogue on fire. And this sort of thing you don't forget, whether you're 10 years old or 100 years old. It was horrible.
They closed down your school. They closed down the newspaper. And no concerts. A city that was known for loving music suddenly went dead. No sound.
The city of Warsaw was under German occupation for 5 long and brutal years. During that time, an entire government operated underground with its own legal system, schools, even newspapers. Its underground army trained battalions and gathered weapons, preparing for the day when it would rise up against the Nazis.
The scale and the horror of those 5 years of German occupation of Warsaw, I think, are unparalleled.
Norman Davies, an Oxford historian who has written a new book about the Warsaw Uprising, says Hitler saw Poland as a laboratory for his racial theories. Jews were herded into a ghetto. Other Poles were rounded up in manhunts to be sent to Germany for slave labor. Warsaw citizens responded by joining the underground army, known by Poles as the AK. Christine Jaroszewicz, at 19, was an underground courier.
There was a code word that I used, and people opened the door to grab the documents, and I was gone, you know.
Underground operations ranged from killing German soldiers to blowing up trains, to acts of rebellion that simply lifted the Polish spirit. Nazi punishment was swift and terrible. Public hangings, mass executions. For every German soldier shot by Poles, 100 civilians were killed.
You know, for retaliation, the Nazis were executing, taking people, 100 people from the streetcars, stopping and methodically counting 98, 99, 100, a machine gun on the spot in front of the streetcar. In one of those operations, I was 103rd.
Inside the ghetto, conditions were worse. People starved in streets littered with corpses. SS soldiers shot Jews at random.
I mean, as bad as things were outside the wall, the inside the wall was incredible.
Jews in the ghetto began to be sent to death camps. In 1943, they fought back. The ghetto uprising lasted a month and ended in tragedy. 40,000 either dead or deported to death camps. Nothing left but burnt hulks of buildings.
Between Laube and Cherbourg in Normandy, the Allied lightning strikes.
By the summer of '44, the war had started to turn. The D-Day invasion of Normandy brought U.S. and British forces onto the continent. Stalin's Red Army, now allied with the U.S. and Britain, was defeating the Germans in battle after battle, marching west towards Warsaw. To the thousands in the underground, waiting for 5 years to strike, the time seemed right. The premier of the Polish government in exile, Stanisław Mikołajczyk, traveled to Washington to gain President Roosevelt's support for an uprising.
The president created the climate where the Poles and the Polish underground felt that they had the full support of America and of the British.
But it was also necessary to gain the support of the Soviet Union, Poland's neighbor and a longtime adversary. Roosevelt urged the premier to fly to Moscow to work it out with Stalin.
Stalin is a good friend of mine. He'll be quite reasonable, and everything will be fine. Roosevelt actually said to the Polish Prime Minister, "Your country will emerge from this war undiminished."
If Roosevelt told the head of the Polish government in exile that he needn't worry about the Russians, he was being disingenuous.
Unbeknownst to Poland, Roosevelt and Churchill had made a deal with Stalin. At the Tehran conference the year before, the Big Three met for the first time. Eager to placate Stalin and keep him in the war, Roosevelt had agreed that more than a third of Poland's territory would go to the Soviet Union.
And that's the occasion when he tells Stalin, in effect, "I know you're going to be in control in Poland and Eastern Europe after the war, and I will not disturb your sphere of influence there." So that bargain is struck.
In Warsaw, where they knew nothing of such a bargain, the underground prepared to fight. The Polish premier had no firm commitment for help from Stalin, but Moscow radio broadcasts urged Warsaw citizens to rise up.
The Russian army was exactly at the gate of Warsaw. We felt, as soldiers in the underground movement, that this was the time to strike.
The Allied victory in Normandy fueled their hopes.
And we believed so much in the West. And we thought, well, they are with us. We are going to win. The Allies are going to win this war.
August 1st, 1944, 5 p.m. The hour set for the Rising to begin. The citizen soldiers of Warsaw couldn't wait.
And you arrive in this fantastic big square, and there are thousands of Polish soldiers, you know, and there are flags all around, and it was incredibly happy feeling.
As dusk fell, the underground fighters took to the streets. To their leaders, the timing was critical. The Russians were close enough to help, but it would be Poles who would liberate Warsaw.
We wanted to free Warsaw ourselves. This was our city, our capital, our country.
These images of the fight in Warsaw, rarely seen outside Poland, were filmed by the underground. The underground army had about 40,000 fighters. Barely a quarter of them went into the battle with a weapon in their hands.
But they had no heavy artillery, no armor, nothing to compare with the huge range of things the Germans had.
So you had the striking force, and then there were followers who were waiting for you to be shot, wounded or killed, so they could pick up your weapon and go ahead. Some of the insurgents were armed with stones.
Many of the weapons they did have were homemade. Flamethrowers fashioned from garden hoses. Grenades made from German bombs.
I got a gun which was buried in 1939 by the Polish army. It was full of rust, so the first time I fired the damn gun, it almost killed me because it fired back. My eye almost lost an eye. But after that, it worked fine.
Civilians joined in, building barricades. Even children helped, small enough to run below the guns on German tanks.
10, 12-year-olds would crawl up and blow up a tank or set it on fire with a gasoline bottle.
2 tanks were actually captured by the insurgents, the only 2 tanks they were to have. Wacław Mitsuta, a veteran of the Polish cavalry, took command of the captured tanks.
I trained at least 2 teams, and in 2 days we were ready to fight.
Mitsuta would stage one of the most daring and memorable attacks of the entire uprising. His target, a concentration camp that existed in the remnants of the Jewish ghetto.
It was thousands and thousands of Jews which were either killed there or sent to be killed elsewhere. It was a death camp.
Mitsuta asked his commander for permission to attack, but was told the camp was too well fortified. They would all be killed.
And our fellows, they were young fellows, and girls too, girls and men. They were this in their blood, and they said, no, we want to attack.
Mitsuta asked if he could take a band of volunteers and one tank. Granted permission, they took the Germans by surprise, storming a 10-foot tall wall that surrounded the camp. Mitsuta and his soldiers let loose with the tank's gun.
Boom, finished. Another one, boom, finished. And the boys running like mad.
Mitsuta and his soldiers liberated the camp. Inside were several hundred Jews, emaciated, expecting death at any moment.
They found out that this is liberation. And my God, it was very emotional, very emotional. There was an old Jew, who came and he put on his knees and he cried and he thanked us. What do you do? They were brothers, they were sisters. For me, there was I never thought that they are Jews. I thought that they are poor people, who are in tremendous, tremendous emotional situation.
Moving into an inner courtyard of the camp, Mitsuta saw a remarkable sight.
But at the end, there were a group of prisoners. My God, I approached them, and there was one with military training, because in a good Polish language, he said, "Patrz, na lewo, patrz," and they written, I give you the Jewish battalion ready to fight.
Mitsuta became their commander, the first Jewish unit of the underground army, a unit he says was always at the forefront of the battle.
And they were fighting like mad. I think 3 of them survived.
The first days of the uprising cost the Poles dearly. Thousands died. And the Germans held on to most of their strongholds. Still, the Polish flag flew in the city center for the first time in 5 years.
Polish national anthem, which could not be heard for 5 years, now was being played. The Polish flags were flying from every house.
The Times of London would write, the first of the martyred cities of Europe to suffer the horrors of German air bombardment and of National Socialist rule, is also the first to see deliverance at hand. By August 3rd, the Citizen Army of Warsaw had actually gained ground against the Nazi war machine for almost 3 days. The Germans counterattacked in force, unleashing planes, tanks, and artillery. In a fury, Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler ordered that Warsaw be made an example for all of Europe. Every inhabitant, man, woman, and child, should be killed.
People were massacred in cold blood. The SS simply stormed into the hospitals, turned all the patients onto the street and machine-gunned them.
Defenseless civilians were herded in front of Nazi tanks as human shields.
And we had to fire. When we started firing at the tanks, they would run over the civilians in front of them.
Americans should realize we're talking about a tragedy where the same number of civilians were killed every day for 60 days that were killed in the World Trade Center.